Let's get started, I guess. Yes, you already heard it. My name is Fatma Deniz. I'm a professor in computer science at the Technologie Universität here in Berlin. And there I research in the intersection between computer science and neuroscience. And I will warn you a little bit. This will be somewhat techy and sciencey. And I did it as simple as possible, but do bear with me. I will walk you through these things. Okay. We will talk about language representations both in humans and machines today. So the human brain is this very complex nonlinear system, dynamic system that allows us to solve a lot of different tasks, natural tasks. When we take, for example, language, we read, listen to books, we listen to a talk, we talk to a good friend, and also learn new languages. So we can actually accomplish still way more things than the current AI systems are capable of accomplishing. And basically, I see the brain as the only system that we would like to have that these AI systems are also able to accomplish in the future. So it's, in some ways, this is an inspiration for the research that we do in the lab. This summarizes pretty well, I think, what we do. We have a computational approach to model, in one side, the human brain processes that are doing multimodal information processing during our everyday tasks. So basically, first, on one side, we have the data science and machine learning approaches that we develop in the lab, and use these to analyze the brain data, to understand the brain while it's doing perception or language or any other cognitive function. And then second side is basically that we are trying to take inspiration from the brain to understand and examine the current AI models, large language models as an example for today, but also use them not only for understand and examine this, but also to fine-tune these models for brain-like representations. So that will be the second part of my talk. And the goal overall is basically that we create this loop that we have on one side the brain representations that inspire the large language models or other AI models, but also use then these inspired, better-made models to then understand the rest of the variance that is not maybe explained in the human brain. So when you're listening currently to me, your brain is processing a hierarchy of information from the processing of phonetics, the sound of speech, to all the way semantics and pragmatics. So our goal is basically in the lab to model, possibly, each of these features and create brain maps. And that's what you see on the left. They don't look to you as brains yet. I will show you why they look like this. So as an example, on the top, you see there's a spectral information processing mainly located in what we so-called early auditory processing cortex regions, where the auditory information is processed. So spectral information is processed there. That's very nice bilaterally. In the bottom, on the other hand, you will see there's a semantic processing, semantic representations that is distributed across the entire brain, again, bilaterally. And we will go into this a little bit more deeper today. So when we study a dynamical nonlinear system like the human brain, we can see this problem for the engineers in the room as a system identification problem. What does that mean? On one side, we have an input. On the other side, we have the output, that is the brain representation that we collect. And in the middle, we need like some machinery that gives us, for the input that the person was reading, listening, or watching a movie or a scene, to understand what the brain is doing. And we would like to build an explicit model in between these, so replace that machine basically, and measure the output given the input. So to do this, we need, first of all, several things. We need to solve these two problems, right? We need to get first data, and also represent the input in some ways so that we can run models on it, quantify it, when we talk about words, for example. Okay, let's start with measuring the brain data. It's clear that in order to understand the human brain, we first need a reliable measurement technique. And for this, we use this gigantic machine that you see here in the screen, which is a MRI. We call it functional MRI because we collect data over time. And we do this while subjects are naturalistically as possible, in this case in a scanner environment. They watch a movie, they listen to stories, they listen to music, or read some text, for example. And this is a best, you can say, non-invasive method that is out there currently for measuring brain responses at once. So even though we have very low temporal resolution, so we really have every 500 milliseconds to 2 seconds, and you can imagine lots of things happens during that time in language, we can see the whole brain at work at once, and that is the benefit of this methodology. So I will now show you how I got you the pictures of the brain earlier. This is the lateral view, so you're looking at this in this side basically. In the front is the prefrontal cortex, and the back is the visual cortex, where the visual information is processed. So this is turning around now, the visual cortex is in the back, the front is coming up, and now the trick is basically we're flattening this brain. This is the cortical surface of one human subject, and then you can see the entire brain at once, as I have shown you earlier. And the inner part of this picture you see is the visual cortex, and the outer part is basically where the prefrontal cortex is for example, decision-making, planning, etc. So next we can design experiments and ask our participants who come to the lab and go into the MRI machine and let them basically read and listen to a story. This was one of our experiments that we did in the lab that you will see in an example. On the top you will see the actual brain, the signal, the data that we collected from the subjects, and on the bottom will be the story that they listened or read in 2 different sessions. And everything that is red is above average activity here, and everything that is blue is below average activity. And you will see that this is pretty noisy data that we are trying to then make sense of and model with large language models.
Hit the brake at the red light. I flung open the door, and I ran. I had no shoes on, I was crying. I had no wallet, but I was okay because I had my cigarettes.
So what we have is basically some autobiographical natural story that people read while they're lying in the scanner or listening, and that gives us very rich data sets that we then start asking questions and different hypotheses. Okay, so we have now some possibility to measure brain activity, brain signals. Now we would like to understand how we can use these words that the subject was perceiving and use them to build a model in between. And for this, basically, we use large language models like BERT, Llama, GPT, that you all are nowadays familiar with. Because since the invention in 2013 with the word embeddings, which we faced a revolution again, actually, in AI, and 2018 with the transformers, which is now in all GPT models, for example, or other models, these LLMs are in many of our everyday tasks, right? We have them as a conversational agent that we discuss and speak, or do even science to some extent. We create contents for specific purposes that make sense to us. We can analyze text for their sentiments or interactively translate between languages. And in a nutshell, these language models are trained on, first of all, millions of text that is out there in the internet to predict at the end a missing word given a sentence. Let's say I have a sentence like the quick brown fox, and then the next word is missing. The LLM will tell you, oh, this is the likely word that comes after that would be probably jumps, right? This is all a statistical measurement based on a gigantic number of data. So how can we make use of these LLMs to, at the end, model brain data? So for us, what is interesting is the internal representations of large language models, okay? So not the output, which was the jumps, right? But we are interested what the large language model is doing and trying to map that to the human brain and see, can we make use of it? Does it explain anything in the brain? So on the top, you are seeing the brain responses that we're collecting over time during the period of a story. In the middle is the stimulus, right? The human, whatever, public. And then on the bottom is the stimulus representations that I meant some vector representations. These are numbers that are quantifying these words that we are presenting to the people, learned by this big machinery that I mentioned earlier. And what we would like to have is an alignment at the end between these more biological representations and the artificial representations. Okay, now we have the brain data, a way to quantify our words. This is the LLM in between. So now we can build a model that learns basically a function, and that function finds a mapping between the stimulus representation and in this case, the internal representation of the large language model, but this can be something else as well, and then the measured brain responses. So we are trying to find a mapping between basically the left, your left, I guess, and my right, your right, sorry. Okay, given this modeling framework and the listening and reading experiment that I already introduced you basically when you, that the subjects were exposed to, we can start asking lots of different scientific questions. So that's the greatness about this method also, that we give them a rich data set, like a rich story, and we can build upon our hypothesis basically afterwards. So one question that we can ask is very simple: where in the brain at all do word meaning is represented, right? Where are these, in which regions? The other one would be, now we have listening and reading, we can ask, well, actually, are the semantic representations between reading and listening similar or different? And I would like to ask this question to you guys. Who thinks these are similar? Oh, way fewer than I thought. Okay, we'll see what comes out. So then the other question is basically, do semantic representations differ when you read now a book in different languages, German, Turkish, English, Chinese? Okay, let's start with the first two questions. To answer the question, again, I will walk you through a little bit through this process. We have a training and a testing stimuli. We have to kind of like see whether the model that I built is also in any way reliable. So that's why we need to test stimuli. First, we go to the scanner, we collect the data for listening and reading, and then we get the internal representations for the large language model, and then use something called regularized linear regression to find a mapping, a function between these internal representations of the LLM for the words and the brain responses that we collected using the functional MRI machine. And then this function basically learns now what specific internal representations of that large language model are explicitly encoded in a particular part in the human brain. We call that a voxel, which is a three-dimensional pixel from the picture that we take in the MRI machine. So then we go to the scanner again. We have a test stimuli, a new stimuli, which is a new story basically, and then run the stimuli first through the large language model and also collect the brain data. But when we get the internal representation for this new stimuli, we use the function that we learned earlier in the training phase and map basically this stimuli representation through that function in order to give me a brain representation, a prediction that we call. Okay? So now we have a recorded brain response that I know what my ground truth is, and below we have that predicted brain response given a large language model and the function that I learned. And by this, we are comparing this now, and we want to know how well did my model, my semantic model, my large language model do in explaining the brain responses. And that number we call the prediction accuracy. It's basically a similarity matrix between this predicted and recorded brain activity. Okay, this number we map then back to our human brain. And to give you the answer that I asked earlier for the question, these look, if I may say that, very similar. On the top you have listening, on the bottom you have reading. Everything that is more yellow is basically the model is predicting very well. And this is very similar between listening and reading, first of all. We also have the regions, I will name them for you, but I can't point them towards you, or I can do it, why not? We have here the visual cortex, we have here the temporal cortex, parietal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex. And we can see that the brain is very much distributed, the representations of the semantic model is very much distributed across the brain bilaterally and also for listening and reading. So that suggests basically that information is distributed across the cortex, for example, first, and is also very similar between these two modalities, listening and reading. There are some differences. The differences lie mainly in the sensory regions, which would totally make sense. If you concentrate on everything that is orange, you see that the early sensory regions, like the visual cortex or auditory cortex, is different in processing the information, but the rest is very similar. Moving on, we can also look how, not only like where this information is, but also what type of information is processed in the brain. So we map back to the large language model from the learned weights from our model, and then can assign literally categories or words onto that representation. For example, here we can see a particular part of the brain is actually representing words like family, marriage, like socially related words, but also other categories. And again, this is quite similar between reading and listening. Okay, this again suggests that the semantic representations during these two modalities is very similar, not only in terms of like where information is processed, but also what type of information is processed. We asked the other question, which is basically, do these representations change when you, for example, read something in a different language? For this, we went onto the scanner, we did a new experiment. In this case, the experiment is reading, where subjects first read a story in English and then in Chinese. And we again split the data in two halves, training and testing, did all the modeling that I mentioned earlier, and looked at the results. And to my surprise, I have to say, they look very similar in English and Chinese. There's a high correlation between the representations between these two brain maps that you see on the screen. But we also see there are different clusters where these representations are highly similar. These are family, communication, cognition, location, or numbers. We also see, in fact, in numbers, subtle changes, and this is very subtle. I don't have an extra slide for this. Nevertheless, subtle but significant changes where some categories, like numbers, when you use words like navigation, like coordinates, for example, right? When you describe a navigation with the coordinates in numbers, or when you use quantity words like kilometer numbers, for example, depending on the language, there will be a change in these particular categories, for example, in numbers. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I would like to go more into the other way, right? Until now, what we did is the top arrow, which is given a stimulus input that the brain read, how can we use large language models, for example, to understand what the brain is doing, right? Reading, listening, different languages. So now we would like to close that loop and use the brain as an improvement process or an alignment process for making the large language models essentially better. So the question basically is, can we fine-tune, and this is a technical term that I will introduce you, large language models using the brain data that we have for improved human-machine alignment and better task performance. So one unique quality of these large language models that I mentioned earlier is not only that they are very good at predicting the next word or the missing words in a given text, but they're also used as a pre-trained scheme. So when you go to huggingface.com, basically, you do get a lot of these pre-trained models that our research is building upon. And what we can now do is actually we can use these large language models that is pre-trained. We put a new layer, okay? These are different layers, but new layer on top of it. We call that the classifier layer. For example, to do sentiment analysis, right? For a sentence like a visual stunning rumination on love, you would get a classifier that tells, well, this is probably 85% a positive sentence, right? And 15% a negative sentence. As an outcome, you would classify this sentence as a positive sentence. And we do now a trick. Instead of doing the classifier, we do a regression. It doesn't matter so much. But we use the brain data here. So we basically take the words that the person saw. That is aligned with the human brain data because we collected that data. Now we want to see, can I actually train my large language model to predict brain responses? So until now, we did basically just this part. We have the input stimuli, now in Chinese and English. These are bilinguals again. We have the large language model. We get some internal representations. This is the BERT model. That's why the BERT is in there. And then we have the brain responses that we collected. This is so far what we did. So now we add this like linear projection layer or this regression layer on top. We try to predict brain responses, and we build something we call the loss function. And that loss function is basically comparing what I told you earlier, the predicted response with the recorded brain response, because that's the good thing about this. I have the ground truth information, what the brain has been doing when it was listening to a particular story or reading a story. Then we update, based on this loss function, the weight according to the loss function back into the BERT model or the transformer model, in order, like with the goal that it minimizes across many, many iterations, and then I'm done. I can use that large language model and basically test or see if that large language model was performing good or bad. So two questions come up. We can basically now, if I have this fine-tuned or brain-informed large language model, how does this brain-informed large language model now do in predicting brain responses? Do I get any improvement, or it doesn't care? Or the second question is, how well does a brain-informed large language model perform, for example, what we call linguistics tasks, natural language processing downstream tasks, for those who know the field? So first question, how well does brain-informed large language model do in predicting brain responses? I have here what we call the 2D color mapped brain. Everything that is in blue you see is the vanilla BERT. The vanilla means it's not fine-tuned. It's the pre-trained model that we took off the shelf. And everything that is in magenta is basically what we fine-tuned towards brain-like representations. And you can see that we have around 70% of our voxels, the regions in the brain, that prefer more this fine-tuned model, which is maybe not surprising because that's what I train it towards. The more interesting part is actually the second question. Do these large language models also perform better if I go and test them on the benchmark linguistic tasks that we are testing these in the field? So first, we can use downstream tasks like GLUE, it's one of them called. The other one is for English tasks, and the other one is CLUE for Chinese tasks. These are basically natural language inference tasks, okay? Right? Given two sentences, are they plausible or not? This is what it tests for. So when I'm monolingual, a large language model that is only trained in one language, let's say Chinese BERT, are fine-tuned with brain data in the bilingual subject's brain, but in the second language, which is this Chinese data now, we do, in fact, observe from 9 tasks in all of them in English linguistics tasks, and the other way around in 5 out of 7 Chinese tasks. What this basically does this mean? It basically means we can teach a large language model using brain data with this fine-tuning mechanism in new language. Right? If I wouldn't even have text, it can just do it because of the fact that the bilinguals can do this as well. And the same we also show the same improvement we also show when we, for example, use a multilingual BERT. The multilingual BERT has this capability that it learned not only in one language, like the Chinese BERT, for example, but in many languages. So it can translate between languages. But even in those, when I align them towards the brain information, we do find improvements in all of our tasks, actually, for English as well as for Chinese tasks. So these observations that we see in large language models are most likely possible because the brain has the shared semantic information that I mentioned earlier. Right? I showed you that when I read a book in English or in Chinese and other languages, the representations are pretty similar. So we process the information semantically quite similarly. So therefore, we can leverage this information, or like this property of the brain, to enable also for the large language models cross-transfer translations between languages. This is just for completeness for all the NLP experts, that we did all the work that we need to do to give you the summary. Okay, to give you a conclusion, NeuroAI, the intersection between neuroscience and artificial intelligence, is basically a powerful framework to understand not only the brain, which we use in everyday scientific work that we do, but also to improve or align the large language models better with the human responses. I also talked to you about semantic representations that are similar between reading and listening, but also across different languages, for example, Chinese and English. And also that brain-informed large language models do, in fact, lead to representations that are better at explaining the human brain responses, first of all, but also, again, improving large language model performance on the linguistic tasks in let's say, unseen languages for the model, even though the model did not recognize any of these languages before. With that, first of all, I would like to thank my lab. This is many people who are doing extremely hard but cool work, our collaborators, our funding agencies, and I would like to thank you for listening. And we have a brain viewer. We have a brain viewer with the QR code. You can go check it and play around with it and get inspired. Thank you.